The slap came before she even finished the sentence. Rosalind had barely gotten the words out. "Dad, I've been accepted. They're offering me a place in the nursing program at Dal, and I want to take it." When Eugene's palm connected with her cheek so hard that she staggered sideways into the kitchen doorframe, the envelope slipped from her hand and landed on the linoleum floor. She could hear Marjorie somewhere behind her, a sharp intake of breath, and then nothing. Just the ringing in her ear and the slow, cold realization that no matter how carefully she had planned this conversation, it had already gone wrong. "You're not going anywhere," Eugene said. His voice was the same voice he used when he told her to bring in the woodpile or hang the washing before the rain came. Flat, final, like the subject was already closed. "I told you before, a woman your age has no business running off to some city." "I'm 26, Dad." "You're my daughter." He bent down and picked up the envelope himself, not to give it back to her, but to set it face down on the counter. "Out of sight, and I made a promise." She didn't understand what he meant, not yet. The town of Mahone Bay sat on the south shore of Nova Scotia, the kind of place that looked beautiful in photographs and felt suffocating if you'd grown up in it. The 3 churches along the waterfront had been in every travel magazine that had ever covered the Maritimes. Tourists came in the summers to take pictures and eat chowder and say things like, "Isn't it charming?" But Rosalind had grown up behind those postcards. She knew the way the gossip moved through the town like weather, fast, low to the ground, difficult to outrun. She had worked for 3 years at the hospital in Bridgewater, 40 minutes down the highway, as an administrative clerk. She had saved money quietly, in an account her father didn't know existed. She had applied in secret. She had been accepted. She had done everything right, or so she had believed, and she had come home on a Thursday afternoon to tell her parents, to ask for their blessing, and to begin the next chapter of her life. Instead, she stood in the kitchen with a stinging cheek and an overturned plan. "What promise?" she asked. Eugene sat down at the table. Marjorie moved quietly to the stove and began stirring something that didn't need stirring. Rosalind had seen her mother do that 100 times. Find a task, any task, rather than stand still in the middle of her father's anger. "The Aldriches," Eugene said. "Their boy Conrad, good family, good land. His father and I spoke about this 2 years ago." 2 years. Rosalind sat down because her legs had gone strange. "You had a conversation about me 2 years ago and didn't tell me." "You were away," he said, as though that explained it. "Conrad is 32, he's settled. He has the house on the peninsula and part of his father's property management business. He came by last month asking about you." "Dad, I don't know Conrad Aldrich. I met him twice at the Wharf Festival, and he barely looked at me." "He looked enough." Eugene reached for his mug. "His family's coming Sunday. You'll sit down with them and be decent about it." Rosalind looked at her mother. Marjorie was still stirring. The spoon clinked against the side of the pot in a small, steady rhythm, like a clock counting down. "Mom," Rosalind said. "Your father knows what's best," Marjorie said quietly, without turning around. That night, Rosalind sat on the end of her old bed and looked at the acceptance letter for a long time. The lamp on the nightstand was the same one she'd had since she was 12. The quilt was one her grandmother had made. Every object in the room was a version of who she'd been, before she figured out who she wanted to become. She heard a soft knock. The door opened a crack and Teddy's face appeared. 14 years old, still at the age where he knocked but didn't always wait for an answer. "Did he hit you?" Teddy asked. "It's fine," she said. He came in anyway and sat on the floor with his back against the bed, the way he used to when he was small and had a nightmare. "I heard," he said. "About the Aldriches, about Sunday. Don't worry about it." "Roz," he said, "you should just go, take your bag and go tonight." She shook her head. The door was too visible from her parents' room. The floor in the hallway creaked in 3 specific places she'd memorized as a teenager. She had thought about it already, turning the whole thing over in her mind like a problem she couldn't quite solve. "Not tonight, Sunday. After they leave. I'll talk to him again, when he's calmer." But Sunday came and went and nothing was calmer. The Aldriches arrived in a dark SUV that took up most of the driveway. Agatha came first, a tall woman in a good coat, the kind of person who assessed a room the moment she entered it. Conrad followed. He was not unkind-looking, Rosalind supposed, but there was something remote about him, a blankness behind the eyes, the polished manner of someone who had learned to perform warmth without feeling it. They sat in the living room and drank tea, and Agatha asked Rosalind questions about what she did, where she worked, whether she enjoyed cooking. Rosalind answered with the careful politeness she had learned growing up in a small town, where a wrong word could follow you for years. She said nothing about Halifax. She said nothing about the letter. When the Aldriches left, Agatha pressed an envelope into Eugene's hands. He waved it away. She pressed it again. The second time, he kept it. Rosalind watched from the hallway and felt something cold settle in her stomach. That evening, she tried again. She sat across from her father at the kitchen table and kept her voice level and said, "Dad, I need you to hear me. This program is what I've been working toward for 3 years. Nursing is what I want to do. I want to actually help people, not just file their paperwork. This is my life, and I'm asking you to let me have it." Eugene didn't answer right away. He folded his hands on the table and looked at her, the way he looked at a fence that needed repairing, like a problem he'd already decided how to handle. "Conrad's a good man," he said. "You'll learn that." "I don't want to learn it. I want to go to Halifax." "No." He stood up. "You're staying. If you were smart, you'd see what I'm doing for you." "What you're doing to me," Rosalind said. The words came out before she could stop them, which meant they were the truest words she'd said all week. Eugene's chair scraped hard against the floor. His face went red the way it did when he felt embarrassed. Not sorry, never sorry, but embarrassed, which in him looked almost identical to rage. He grabbed the acceptance letter off the counter where it had sat for 3 days and tore it in half. Rosalind didn't cry. She was surprised by that. She just looked at the 2 pieces of paper on the floor and thought, "I'll remember this exactly." After that, Eugene became careful in a way that frightened her more than his anger had. He told Marjorie not to go out without him. He started checking that the front door was locked at night. He said it was for security. He said a lot of things that were for security. On the Wednesday after the Aldriches' visit, she stood in the hallway and listened to him on the phone in the living room. "The wedding date," he was saying. "Yes, I know it's soon, but she needs settling down. If we wait too long, she'll get ideas." She pressed her back against the wall. Her hands were shaking. She found Teddy in his room after dinner and told him everything. He listened with his face going very still, in the way it did when he was frightened but trying not to show it. "I need the spare key," she said. "The one on the hook in the garage." "Dad locks the garage now," Teddy said. "I know, but the side window hasn't latched properly in 2 years. You can get through there." Teddy was quiet for a long moment. "If he finds out, he'll be angry at me, not you. He'll be angry at both of us." "Teddy." She put her hand on his shoulder. "I love you, and I need you to understand that if I stay here and marry Conrad Aldrich, I will lose something I can't get back. I'm not being dramatic. This is just true." He looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. 2 nights later, Rosalind was packed. 1 bag, her savings card, her ID, the photocopy of the acceptance letter she'd made at the Bridgewater Library before coming home. She had memorized the bus schedule. She had a friend in Halifax who had offered a couch. Past midnight, she heard Teddy's footsteps in the hallway, the softest possible footfall. The door opened and he pressed the key into her palm without a word. He had tears on his face and was pretending he didn't. "I'll call you," she whispered. "Go," he said. "Hurry." She was halfway down the driveway when the porch light clicked on. "Rosalind." Her father's voice, quiet, which was worse than if he had shouted. She stopped. She heard his footsteps on the gravel and she felt the October cold against her face, and she thought very clearly, "Keep walking." But her legs had stopped listening. The first hit caught her across the shoulders. The second knocked her bag from her grip. She stumbled forward and caught herself on the gatepost, and she heard Teddy shout something from the porch, and then she heard him running toward them, and then she heard the sound of her father's hand across her brother's face. That sound was the one she would carry the longest. Eugene dragged her back inside. He used words she had heard before and words she hadn't. He used the word disgraced. He locked her door from the outside with a bolt he must have installed in the days since the Aldriches' visit, and she understood then that he had been waiting for her to try. She sat on the floor of her room until morning. It was Teddy who saved her, in the end. 2 weeks later, the wedding date had been set for November. Rosalind had heard Marjorie crying quietly through the wall, and understood that even her mother thought it was too soon, but that Marjorie would say nothing. Because Marjorie had not in 31 years of marriage said anything, Eugene didn't want to hear. Teddy had made a copy of the spare key before his father took it back, had it cut at the hardware store in Chester during a school trip. He slid it under her door on a Sunday afternoon with a note that said only, Thursday, 4 a.m., I set an alarm. When Thursday came, she left with one bag and her boots and the coat off the hook by the door. She walked to the highway and flagged the first eastbound bus to Halifax. She did not look back until the lights of Mahone Bay had disappeared entirely into the dark. She called Teddy from the Halifax terminal at 6 in the morning. He answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't slept. "Did you make it?" he said. "I made it," she said. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Be good," she said finally. "Don't fight with him. Just get through school and come find me when you're older." "I will," he said. Halifax was not what she had imagined, or it was exactly what she had imagined and she wasn't prepared for it anyway. The city was bigger and louder and colder than Mahone Bay, and her friend's couch lasted 2 weeks before she found a room in a boarding house on Roby Street. The building was drafty, and the radiators made noise all night, and the woman who ran it, Alma, was in her 70s and had opinions about everything. But Alma also left soup outside Rosalind's door the first week without being asked, and said, "You look like someone who could use a good meal," and didn't follow it with questions. Rosalind found herself sitting at Alma's kitchen table more evenings than she'd expected, drinking tea and talking about nothing in particular, and slowly the knot in her chest began to loosen. She enrolled in the nursing program in January with her savings and a bursary she'd found online. She worked weekends at a pharmacy. She studied until her eyes ached. She built a life from the ground up, the way you do when you've had to leave everything behind, carefully, deliberately, one small thing at a time. The person she didn't expect was Remy. He lived at the end of the hall, a quiet man from Cape Breton studying architecture who always left his drafting pencils on the kitchen table. He started bringing her coffee during late-night study sessions. He said small, funny things that made her laugh without expecting anything in return. He was patient with her in a way that felt genuinely new, unhurried, uncomplicated. By spring, she trusted him. By summer, she loved him, or something she believed was love, which at that point in her life felt like the same thing. They married the following year in a small ceremony in Halifax. Marjorie came. Teddy came, 17 now, and taller than she remembered, with their mother's shyness and their father's stubbornness, and his own easy laugh that belonged to neither of them. Eugene did not come. Remy's mother Phyllis was warm and loud and fed everyone too much. Rosalind had never had that. The easy, noisy kind of family gathering where no one was performing anything for anyone else. It felt like an exhale she had been holding for years. She graduated from the nursing program 8 months after the wedding. Remy was in the front row with Alma and Teddy and Phyllis, and he stood up when they called her name. She thought she had done it. She thought the hard part was over. The first sign was small, a missed call she wasn't meant to see. Remy leaving the room to take his phone. She told herself these things meant nothing. She reminded herself that she had come from a family where she'd learned to distrust her own instincts, where doubt had been something other people planted in her rather than something she'd grown herself. She told herself, "You are not your father. You do not have to see danger in ordinary things." But Kezia was not an ordinary thing. Kezia had been Rosalind's closest friend in Halifax since the first week of the nursing program. They'd shared textbooks and shifts, and the particular kind of friendship that forms between people who are both slightly exhausted and trying not to show it. Rosalind had trusted Kezia with things she didn't tell anyone else. She'd talked about her father. She'd talked about Mahone Bay. She'd talked about what it felt like to be slapped by the person who was supposed to protect you. She found out on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 3 years into the marriage, when she came home early from a canceled shift and found Kezia's car in the driveway. She stood there for 30 seconds. Then, she walked inside. The house was quiet in the way houses are quiet when something has just happened, and the people in it don't know yet that they've been discovered. She walked upstairs. She opened the bedroom door. Kezia saw her first. The look on her face, not guilt, not even shame, but something closer to calculation, assessing the situation, was something Rosalind would not forget. "Roz," Kezia said. "Don't," Rosalind said. Remy sat up. He ran his hand over his face. He looked tired, which struck her as strange. Not frightened, not guilty, just tired, as if what she'd interrupted was something he'd been doing for a long time and had not fully decided to stop. "How long?" she said. "Roz. How long?" The silence was its own answer. She walked downstairs and sat on the kitchen floor because she did not trust her legs to carry her to a chair. The thing about this particular betrayal, and she would think about it later, much later, when she had enough distance, was not the betrayal itself. It was the arithmetic, all the moments she had chosen to trust him. All the times she had said to herself, "You are safe now. You are finished with the hard part." She had done the work of rebuilding herself from the ground up, and she had handed the finished thing to the wrong person, and she had not seen it coming. Kezia left without speaking to her. Remy came downstairs and said he was sorry. He said it had been happening for 7 months. He said he didn't know how to explain it. He said a lot of things that were true and none of them were enough. Rosalind looked at him for a long time. "Get out," she said. "Not tonight. Tonight I'm leaving. But you need to be gone before I come back." She drove to Alma's. Alma was 82 by then and moved slowly, and asked no questions and made tea, and sat across from her at the familiar kitchen table, while Rosalind cried until she had nothing left. "The worst part," Rosalind finally said, "is that I should have seen it." "No," Alma said plainly. "The worst part is that he did it. The rest is just what you're feeling right now. That'll change." The divorce was completed by March. Remy moved out. Kezia sent a message that Rosalind didn't answer. The nursing program she had fought so hard to enter had by now given her a career, and she was good at her job, genuinely good, the kind of nurse that patients ask for by name, the kind that other nurses come to with questions. She threw herself into it, the way she always threw herself into the things that were truly hers. Months passed, then a year, then 2. She bought a small apartment in the north end of Halifax, with a window that looked out over a maple tree that went extraordinary in October. She filled it with things she had chosen herself. She cooked food she liked. She called Teddy on Sundays. She visited Phyllis sometimes, because Phyllis had decided that a divorce was no reason to stop being family, which Rosalind thought was one of the most generous positions she had ever encountered. She heard things about Mahone Bay the way you hear things when you come from a small town, through Teddy, through old acquaintances who still sent messages occasionally. She heard that Conrad Aldrich had filed for bankruptcy 2 years after his family's property management business collapsed. She heard that Agatha had moved to be near her sister in New Brunswick. She heard that the big house on the peninsula had sold. She did not feel satisfaction about any of it. She felt, more than anything, tired of the whole story, tired of carrying it. Then one morning in November, she was halfway through a 12-hour shift in the cardiac care unit when the paramedics brought in a man from Mahone Bay who'd had a cardiac event on the highway outside Hubbard's. She checked the name on the intake form and stood still for a moment before she walked into the bay. Eugene was 63. He looked smaller than she remembered. His face was gray and his hands, which had always seemed large to her, were lying open at his sides in a way that looked unfamiliar. Without purpose, without authority. He was conscious, barely, and his eyes found her face, and something moved through them that she couldn't name. She checked his vitals. She spoke to him the way she spoke to every patient, calmly, clearly, without anything extra, and told him what was happening and what they were going to do. She held his hand when they moved him for the scan, because that was what you did for a frightened patient, and he was frightened. She could see that plainly. Marjorie arrived 2 hours later with Teddy, who was 22 now, and drove his mother everywhere. Rosalind met them in the family room and explained what the doctors had told her, and Marjorie held her hands and couldn't seem to let go. Eugene was in hospital for 6 days. Rosalind was not his primary nurse, but she checked on him. She brought him water. She adjusted his blanket when he was sleeping. On the 4th day he was awake and more himself, and she came in on her break and sat in the chair beside his bed. They were quiet for a while. Outside, the hospital went on doing what hospitals do. "Rosalind," he said. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "I do." His voice was rough. He looked at the ceiling. "I do." She waited. "I was wrong," he said finally, each word coming out as if it cost him something. "About Halifax. About all of it. I told myself it was for you, that I was protecting you." He stopped. "I know what I did." She looked at her father, this man who had controlled her and frightened her, and forced her out of her own home, and missed every year that followed. She thought about what she had imagined feeling in a moment like this. During all the time she had pictured it. She had expected anger, or something close to relief, or the particular satisfaction of being owed an apology and finally receiving one. What she actually felt was something quieter. A kind of grief for everything the time could have been, set alongside a recognition that the time was over, that it had already been what it was, that nothing he said now could change the shape of the past. but it could change the shape of what came next. I know, she said. His jaw tightened. He was still not a man who cried easily. She could see him fighting it. You turned out. He stopped, started again. The way you are with people, I saw it, these past few days. Your mum told me. I should have. He couldn't finish the sentence. Dad. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees. I don't need you to fix it. We both know it can't be. But I'd like to try to be okay with each other, if that's something you want. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw in his face something she had not seen there in a very long time. Not certainty, not authority. Just an ordinary aging man who had made serious mistakes and knew it. Yes, he said. That's something I want. She drove home that night through the November dark, with the heater going and the radio on low. Halifax was lit up ahead of her. That particular scattered brightness of a city on the water on a clear night. She thought about Teddy, who would be driving Marjorie back to Mahone Bay, and was probably already planning how often he could get his parents up to Halifax. Now that the distance had finally been crossed. She thought about Alma, who she would call tomorrow and tell everything, and who would say something plain and correct, and not a word more than necessary. She thought about the woman who had stood in a kitchen in Mahone Bay, with a burning cheek and an acceptance letter on the floor, and believed, in that moment, that she was finished before she'd even started. She had not been finished. She had only been at the beginning of something she couldn't yet see the shape of. She had earned every piece of the life she'd built, not because someone gave it to her or decided it for her, but because she had gone after it herself, through everything, and kept going when it fell apart, and kept going again after that. There was no other secret. There had never been one. The maple tree outside her apartment had dropped all its leaves by now, but in the lamplight from the street, she could see the branches clearly against the November sky, bare and precise, and not diminished at all by what they'd let go of, ready for whatever came next. She went inside and put the kettle on,